change stuff that I do, and conservation science, which is really relevant to the environmental impact stuff that I'm interested in. So my work is quite broad and pretty scattered between different sort of points of interest, but a large part of what I do has to do with sustainable diets and with inequalities and how feasible it is for people to adopt sustainable diets. So that's some of what I'll be talking about today. Are you happy for me to start with the talk? Jessica, great. All right. Yeah, well, thanks for having me here. I'll talk a bit about some of my work on sustainable diets and just more broadly on some of the background around that, because I thought it might be interesting to this audience. So I want to focus specifically on reducing meat consumption in the UK, and I'll provide a bit of background on what sustainable diets look like and where we're at sort of in relation to that at the moment, what needs to happen to get us there, and I'll suggest a little bit of food for thought and how we might be able to make that happen. So I'm guessing that for people who are coming to a talk on sustainable diet, it's probably not really big news that the planet just can't continue to support the amount of meat that we're eating currently in high-income countries in particular, like the UK. So diet actually makes up about a third of UK greenhouse gas emissions, and that amount of carbon will probably lead to about 2 degrees of warming by the end of the century alone if we don't change trajectories. So what I find quite impressive in that is that even if we stop burning fossil fuels, which we're not really on trajectory to do, the food system is still a really substantial source of emissions. That means we could really be in trouble. So if we look at where these emissions come from, meat and dairy actually make up for more than half of greenhouse gas emissions, but they only really provide less than a fifth of the calories that we're consuming. So that's really not very efficient at all. Livestock farming, which of course produces the meat and the dairy that we eat, also dominates the way that we use our land. And that of course means that that land is not available for other purposes, like more efficiently producing food calories, or just for other types of land that would sequester carbon, like woodlands, for example. And it's also a really big factor in biodiversity loss, for example, by driving species out of that land, out of their natural habitats. And if you look at where exactly the problem comes from, it's pretty clear that animal products, and especially red meats like beef and lamb, are associated with really high emissions. And even vegetarian animal products like cheese, for example, are much higher carbon than plant-based alternatives like tofu, which is often sort of in the single digit numbers of kilograms of greenhouse gas emissions per 100 grams of protein, as opposed to, for example, beefs from beef herds, which can be up to over 100 kilograms of greenhouse gas emissions. So just to sum that up briefly, even the lowest impact animal products are more impactful than their vegetarian substitutes. There's this really useful analysis done by a group of researchers at Oxford a couple of years ago to look at how much carbon is needed to support different types of diets that people eat in the UK. So for people who eat a lot of meat, we actually need about 7 kilograms of carbon per day to support those diets. And that goes down quite significantly even when people just reduce the amount of meat that they eat. And then vegetarian and vegan diets are associated with even less carbon. Now, if we wanted to look at what a healthy and sustainable diet could look like, of course, government guidelines around healthy eating have been around for a while. But what was new was that in 2019, a report came out on what's called the planetary health diet. So this was a commission of researchers who published a sort of comprehensive scientific proposal for sustainable and healthy diets to feed the planet, which is sort of proportionally represented by this plate for a reference intake of about 2,500 calories a day, which is quite a lot. So what you'll notice immediately in that representation is that there should really be a large variety of fruits and vegetables and nuts and legumes that people are eating, and much less meat and dairy. For whole grains, that also takes up quite a bit of the planetary health diet. So for example, that 1.5 kilos of whole grains per week could look like half a loaf of bread, and then perhaps a serving of whole grain rice or pasta or oats with most meals. The planetary health diet also relies quite heavily on legumes, so lentils, chickpeas, nuts, things like that. And the planetary health diet does include or can include some dairy and some meat. So for example, a glass of milk a day, or I should say up to a glass of milk a day, and some meat as well, up to 300 grams of meat. But out of those 300 grams, only up to 100 grams of red meat. I do want to note, though, that there's suggestions for meat and dairy consumption in zero, and suggested intake in total, so up to 17 kilograms of meat, including waste per person per year, is only about 1/5 or 1/6 of what people are actually eating in the UK right now. So we still have quite a long ways to go in making that happen. No, as I've sort of mentioned before, we're eating too much meat as a country and in high-income communities in general at the moment, and it's not decreasing quickly enough. It's actually quite difficult to get reliable estimates on how much meat people are eating exactly. There was quite a nice analysis done on this last year, sort of trying to reconcile the different data sets. It depends a lot on whether, what type of measurement you're using. So if you're asking people to fill in a food diary where they might forget or conveniently forget some of the foods that they've eaten, versus if you look at what people buy versus that production data. But if at all, meat intake has been decreasing very modestly over the past decades or so. So I'd sort of estimate low single-digit percentage points. Data sets agree a little more on reductions in ruminant meat purchases and supplies. So again, that's anything that comes from a cow or from a sheep. So that has been going down, but it's still far above sustainable limits. So we still need to reduce that quite a bit as well. So given that we're currently eating a lot more meat as a population that's sustainable, how can we change diets? If you ask a psychologist or a behavioral scientist this question, especially, historically, chances are that they would probably say something to the extent of, well, we need to educate people on the health and the sustainability risks of high meat diets, and then people will adapt their attitudes accordingly, and then, they'll gradually form the intention to eat less meat, eat more vegetarian. And then over time, gradually people will change their behavior as well. But from looking at the data, and probably also, as many of us know from personal experience, that's not quite how it tends to work. So lots of interfering factors can keep people from translating those intentions that they may have formed into behavior. So saying, I want to reduce my meat consumption, to then actually doing it. Diets in particular, we know, can be associated with very strong habits, right? People tend to eat at roughly the same time of day, tend to like the same foods, perhaps what's on offer in the canteen really influences dietary choice. What I've called bounded rationality here just refers to the fact that our willpower is limited, our cognitive capacity is limited, especially when we're hungry. And contexts that we make our food choices in don't necessarily support sustainable food choice, right? So there may not be many vegetarian options, or they may not be cheap enough. And I'd also argue that the behavior change literature in general has often hugely overemphasized how much agency people have in changing their behavior, especially when we take into account inequalities, and I'll come back to this later. So just as a little interim summary, behavior change is actually more difficult than we sometimes like to think, and it's particularly difficult when meat products remain relatively cheap, readily available, and just culturally normative to consume as well. So providing information or trying to increase people's motivation and asking them to try harder often isn't successful in changing behavior. So there's this really nice review done on this gap between intention and behavior that concluded that intentional control of behavior is a great deal more limited than we previously thought. And so future efforts to change behavior might do well to consider non-intentional routes to action. So meaning that we should, as a scientific community, probably steer away a little more from trying to get people to use willpower to change behavior. So if you're wondering what non-intentional routes to action might look like, perhaps you've heard of Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, where he makes this distinction between two types of decision making. And that's, of course, very much a simplification. But sort of broadly speaking, he distinguishes between decision making that's conscious, reasoned, intentional, so deliberative behavior, versus behavior that's non-conscious, automatic, planned. And that's where it becomes clear how good intentions can really easily be overridden in the moment, right? So decision contexts, so the immediate context that people choose a meal in, for example, the cafeteria where you choose your lunch at work, can really strongly cue automatic behaviors, and that can really easily override contrary intentions. So if the meat option, for example, is very visible from where you're standing in line, and perhaps also cheaper and very appealing looking, you might go for that option even though you'd originally intended to buy the veggie meal. So knowing that decision context can have a really strong influence on behavior, what are the types of interventions that we might think to use to get people to adopt more sustainable diets? So if you imagine you're at your work cafeteria and perhaps you're standing in line for lunch, what you're looking at in terms of the available food options is what we describe in the literature as the physical microenvironment. So how available are vegetarian food options? How are they placed in terms of distance, right? Is the first thing that you can see the vegetarian option, or is it the meat option? What are the portion sizes, etc.? Now, there's actually some really interesting work, field experiments done in Cambridge cafeterias a few years ago, where they doubled the proportion of vegetarian meals that were on offer in some of the cafeterias. And then they didn't change anything in the control sites. And compared to the control sites, doubling the proportion of vegetarian meals from 25% previously to 50% with the intervention actually led to a 15 percentage point increase in vegetarian sales, which is really encouraging. And what's particularly nice about this, I thought, is that the intervention was actually effective across different groups of consumers, right? So it wasn't just individuals who'd already been eating a lot of vegetarian meals. This intervention was actually also very effective in people who were previously eating a lot of meat, and overall sales remained constant. So it's not just that meat eaters are going elsewhere to get their burgers. The intervention actually worked for them as well. So that's quite encouraging as one potential pathway for changing physical environments. Another type of environment that we might consider is the fiscal environment. So when you're looking at what to buy at the cafeteria, how much the vegetarian meal costs compared to the meat option, that would be a fiscal consideration, right? Now, given how important food systems and meat in general are to climate change and to health as well, you would think that these would take really high priority on government and organizational agendas, but actually what we find is that those discussions are largely absent from COP, but also from UK government strategies. So, for example, calls for a meat tax were proposed, but then very quickly withdrawn. But what we know from the data is that prices, which could, for example, be changed through taxation, are a really important consideration for UK consumers when they decide what to buy for lunch or for other meals. Now, an important consideration that we could take into account is whom we target with interventions like that, right? How do we tax high emissions food? Who do we target those interventions to? And so one piece of evidence that might be interesting, and that is that in a study that I recently published, we found that people who would like to reduce their meat consumption, but who struggle to bridge that gap between intending to do it and then actually going through with it, are more supportive of policy that increases meat prices, both on the national government level and in an institutional cafeteria setting. And so for a certain segment of consumers who are willing and able, financially to make that change, policy instruments could actually be a promising option in sort of helping regulate that change that people can't seem to self-regulate. Now, the last feature of decision context that I just want to mention briefly is the social environment. So, for example, perceptions of what other people are doing. So what are your colleagues having for lunch at the cafeteria? How normal is it considered to be eating meat or the vegan option, and so on. Now, there was a really interesting study published last year where they beat people several times a day around mealtime to ask them to rate how important each item in the list of reasons was in the meal choice that they just made. And what they found was that in people's own views, the physical and fiscal environments, so was the meal option easy? Did it taste good? Was it inexpensive? Was quite important in meal choice, but so was the social environment, right? So what the individual's peers are having as a food option. And then we see that sustainability concerns rank last in this list. So to me, that just reiterates the importance of changing environments to be more supportive of the concerns that people have in decision making anyway when they choose what to buy. So when we've tried, or when other researchers have tried to sort of leverage that social influence to actually change behavior, evidence for that has been kind of mixed. So there was a recent paper published on that tried to do social norms intervention in a cafeteria. I think they just put these big signs up saying more and more people have been reducing their meat consumption to sort of suggest a social norm around that, but that didn't work very well. So I think we still have some work left to do to figure out how exactly it makes sense to leverage social norms as a potential factor influencing meal choice. I do also want to briefly mention Timothy Lenton's work on positive tipping points. So he's the scientist who sort of published that original paper around climate tipping points and ecosystem, and he sort of proposed a framework mirroring those, of course, very dangerous climate tipping points to describe some potential positive tipping points, like the role of social movements and social norms in bringing about changes in behavior, like, for example, more sustainable diets that can then self-stabilize. So that's something potentially interesting to look into. All right, so knowing that the contexts in which we choose food to eat matter in influencing behavior, who can actually take action in shaping these contexts? I think there's a range of answers that we could give to that question. I'll talk about 3 possibilities out of many. So I'll talk a little bit about the role of individuals in that change, of policymakers, and of organizations. So again, one common response from the behavioral science community around this question might be that individuals can proactively change behavior and also their environments, right? So there is a concept in that literature known as situation selection, where essentially the idea is that we know that it's easy to get caught up in the moment, and so to avoid that temptation in the moment, we shape our environment to support whichever decision we want to make. So that might look like preparing a vegetarian meal in advance and taking it to work, so that we're then not tempted in the moment by the very cheap and appetizing meat options, perhaps. Now, the problem with this is not just that self-control is fallible, or that it requires work in advance, but that agency is not an equally distributed resource. So putting a lot of responsibility on people to do the work in changing behavior, I would argue, ignores how inequalities affect the feasibility of adopting low carbon diets. So we know from the data that wealth inequality really restricts opportunities for behavior change that's sustainable. For example, because low carbon options aren't affordable for everyone because of time poverty, and those who have little money might be working multiple jobs, limited access to supportive infrastructure, less money. So for example, we know that low income neighborhoods can have fewer healthy food outlets. So that's also associated with poor diet quality, and diet quality is richer in higher and richer neighborhoods, even when we control for individual socioeconomic status. So it just means that people who have less money often can't just choose to shop in stores that offer accessible, healthy, and sustainable food options because they might just not be available where they live or where they work, or it might not be affordable. And we're currently collecting data on this specifically for barriers to sustainable diets, right? So what kinds of environments, food environments specifically, do people encounter just as a function of their socioeconomic status, and how hard do people have to work even in the same environment to be able to choose the sustainable option? It's still worth noting, though, I'd say that many people do have agency to make changes in their diets, and that behavior changes in those with more money, who do also tend to be the ones with higher emissions diet, can really have an impact. It's just important to ask the question, I think, of who bears responsibility to reduce diet-related emissions, and for whom that change is feasible, and how we can make those changes as feasible as possible. So I just included an example here of how much shifting from a high meat diet to a lower meat diet would save us on carbon around a ton of CO2 per year, if I've done that calculation correctly, versus someone who's already eating relatively little meat changing to a vegetarian diet. Now, one way to address this problem of agency could be through national and local policy. So in a commentary piece that will hopefully be out at some point later this year, we argue that policymakers really have a very critical role to play just in making low carbon diets and other behaviors that are important for climate and for health more feasible for everyone. So we really need to make sure that low carbon options are accessible. So for example, just making plant-based meals and products available and affordable for everybody, just to level the field. But it's really important to reiterate that I don't believe we can nudge our way out of systemic inequality, right? So even if we make those changes in people's direct environments like cafeterias and supermarkets, systemic inequalities remain, and we can't nudge our way out of that, or to net zero. So even with those changes to decision contexts, we still need systemic changes like progressive taxation and provision of public services that can then enable people to actually choose sustainable diets. And those changes would also make other instruments that we might need to rely on, like carbon taxes, more fair. And so that would hopefully enable us to actually meet human needs within the carbon budget that we have remaining. Yes, and then one last point that I wanted to make here is that attitudes don't necessarily lead to behavior change, right? So setting intentions doesn't necessarily tell us that people will adopt a sustainable diet, but through education and through changing people's attitudes over time, we could potentially see more public pressure to advance policy. So what we actually often find in the data is that people support far more ambitious policies than governments are currently implementing. So that could be a potential additional pathway to see the policy changes that we need. Now, the third kind of entity that could take a role in shaping the context of diets, I think is sometimes overlooked in the discussion. So a really nice piece came out this year or last year, I think, by two Cambridge researchers who have argued that organizations like businesses and NGOs and schools and universities can play a really important role in helping us to get to where we need to be with sustainable diets, especially given how slow governments can be in acting and in implementing policy. So organizations like this university, for example, if we were to adapt to default vegan options, really reduce meat options in cafeterias and stores, that could shape the options that are available to hundreds or thousands of students and employees. And it can also lead to shifts in social norms, right? Foods that are readily available are chosen more often in general, and so that may suggest to people that vegan diets are more normative. And it could also lead to indirect effects, right? So there's a little bit of evidence suggesting that if people start adopting a certain behavior in one context, that might also make it more feasible for them to adopt it in another context, right? Like eating vegan or vegetarian at work, and then actually also implementing that at home too. Okay, so I've talked about a lot of different things today. So in wrapping it up, I just want to reiterate three main points. The most important goal as I see it is that we need to reduce meat consumption in the UK and in other high-income countries that are consuming a lot of meat at the moment to essentially enable us to maintain a healthy planet and healthy people in it, especially red meat, because that's particularly high carbon. We can change decision context to help achieve those changes in diets. For example, by making vegetarian options more available, more accessible, more affordable, and more socially acceptable or normative. And then lastly, as a community of researchers, we may really want to think about the types of interventions that we propose, the level of agency that those interventions ask of people, whom we target, and how policy can help level the opportunity for sustainable diets. Thanks.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you so much. And I imagine the garnet mentioned in the slide is Emma.
Yeah.
Quick question. Is your work considering the subsidies that the dairy in the meat industry is receiving, keeps receiving, and therefore to me seems to be the number one challenge that need to be faced from an economic and trade point of view? And the other question is, could we also have a discussion in terms of good meat against bad meat, i.e. good meat that comes from, for example, grass-fed cows, which might end up being potentially part of a solution against cheap meat that is ultra-processed and comes from highly industrialized cows, animals in general. So I wonder if, again, that kind of debate could be brought into the picture. And the very last comment is, what will happen if, say, the cafeterias just decided to do without the meat option altogether? Would there be people rebelling against the lack of meat, or would they just accept it reasonably quickly?
Yeah, thanks. Those are really good questions. So the first, if I remember correctly, was around some of the skewed economic incentives more on the system level of food production and farming. And I mean, I should really precede that by saying that that's not my area of expertise at all. So perhaps someone else from the audience can actually weigh in on that. But yes, of course, there are hugely skewed incentives in terms of what what is subsidized, and that of course then also affects the consumer, and so of course changes need to happen there as well. I'm just perhaps not the most qualified person in the room to speak to that. The second regarding, is there sort of better meat for us to be consuming? Different types of meat and animal products in general, of course, really differ in terms of, if we just look at carbon, but also land use, biodiversity impacts, in terms of the impact that they have, right? So I showed this one figure briefly that compares beef, for example, even from dairy herds versus purely beef herds in terms of their impacts, but also poultry, mutton. And so there are definitely types of meat that are less carbon intensive than others. Regarding organic and high yield farming, I was actually relatively surprised to learn this a year or two ago. I hadn't been aware that sort of this conviction that people often have that organic and local is good for the planet, is good for you, that actually doesn't really consistently seem to be the case, right? So organic farming takes up a lot of land, and so that's then not available for other types of land use. And so for other reasons as well, in analyses actually in Andrew Balford's group, who I'm partly affiliated with, they find that organic farming can actually be more carbon intensive and more land intensive than other types of farming. So I'd say the answer is nuanced, but overall, I think reducing meat consumption is still sort of the main important overall goal, and especially red meats and ruminant meats. And then, yes, as to what will happen if we just completely cut out meat options. I mean, I think it depends on the context and how we go about it. So one way, for example, in which the actual meat that is consumed could conceivably be reduced quite a bit is, for example, if you look at cafeteria meals, if you have, say, I don't know, a pasta dish with a bolognese sauce and you have ground meat in that, substituting partially, right? So not taking out all the meat, but for example, replacing half of it with lentils, things like that. Some of the behavioral work suggests that it could be helpful instead of sort of saying, oh, we need to take this away, we need to cut all of this out, to focus more on what we want to be implementing in diets instead, right? So saying add more legumes, add more vegetables, things like that. But sort of as I said before, I think that sometimes vocal minorities can also really dominate the discourse on these things, right? And media can really pick up on that very heavily, right? So say, oh, there's just no support at all in the public for meat taxes or for making these changes, when it could also be a not dominant proportion of the population who are sort of very vocal about that, and of course industry who's invested in that as well.
Yeah, more of course to discuss, but I'll